This is Politica, Israeli politics explained at a diaspora volume. Welcome to a new podcast from the Jewish Independent. Israeli politics always seems very complex, very chaotic and very loud. Lots of yelling into microphones and sometimes even into empty rooms. This is a critical year for Israel, and election fever is really now in the air. Even though we don't have a date, I think it would safe to say that the election has started. From the outside, it can be genuinely hard to tell what really matters and what's just distraction. So at Politica, our aim is to turn the volume down so you can really just have a 30-minute chat about what's going on in Israeli politics without really needing to follow all of the news. I'm Sharon Offenberger, joining from Australia, and with me is my co-host Yuval Regev from Israel. As we speak, the very first official moves began towards what is likely to create a slightly early election. It might be more like September than the 27th of October, which is technically the last date to hold an election. This was actually initiated by one of the government's coalition partners, and they're looking to dissolve the Knesset and preempt an early election. Yuval, tell us what's happened there.
Okay, so shalom Sharon and shalom to our listeners. And election fever is very high right now in Israel. We're experiencing very dramatic political days, and everyone knows it's coming. It's right around the corner, right? So we're going into the summer, and right after the summer, it's going to be the fall. And if it's going to be in September or October, those are, that's not a big difference, right? So we are in the heat of the elections, and some say these are going to be the most critical, the most dramatic elections in the history of Israel. We've said this before on the show. I mean, they say this about every election, but this time we know it's different. We know it's different because what happened in the past 3.5 years here in Israel is unprecedented, and the region is changing rapidly, and Israel is changing rapidly. And so these elections are all that important and all that fundamental for so many core issues. Now, what we're seeing in the coming few days is basically the process of moving towards election, and it all begins with a vote of no confidence. Now, in Israel, as the Knesset, and we'll dive into this, but the Knesset is the one that has to form the government by a majority of 61 seats in the Knesset, and they give the government its legitimacy to operate within that majority from the Knesset. So usually the ones to push forward a vote for no confidence are the opposition. And they can do this anytime throughout the government's rule. They've done it several times before. But for it to work, for it to have a majority in the Knesset, they have to find a coalition partner who is willing to vote with them. And that's the threats that are being made right now by the ultra-Orthodox parties. And we'll just say, it's not for the first time that an Israeli government is falling because of this clash between governments and the Orthodox parties. And on the main ticket issue, which is also a main election issue for this cycle, is what we call the draft bill, or really the bill to legally exempt ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students from military service. And that's a big ticket issue in Israel. If you're following Israeli politics, you know that already. So now you know that we're probably going to see quite soon the Knesset dissolve, and then it takes, a few more rounds of voting after the preliminary vote. But, within 3 months, we should be seeing elections after the bill is passed.
So let's give our audience a bit of an explainer around really what happens when in the election process and the voting process and how the Knesset is built. So in order to make any sense of it, let's just start with the basics. And there are 120 seats in the Knesset. That the Knesset is Israel's only parliament. It's really central to Israel's democracy because of that. The Knesset makes the laws, it selects the prime minister, and it also holds the government to account. The 120 Knesset members don't represent a specific or geographic electorate. So that's a really major difference in Australia, where we have a local representative that we vote for. They will be from a party or might be independent, but they really represent a specific area, and they get then voted into the parliament. In Israel, it doesn't work like that. The MKs don't represent specific electorates. What they represent is a political party. And then when you vote, all you're doing is voting for a political party. You have one petek, and you put that petek. It has the party that you want, and that's it. That's the beginning and the end of the voting process.
It's a simple process with a very complex outcome, I would say.
It starts simple and ends complicated. I find that particular difference says a lot about the difference between Australian politics and Israeli politics. Because in Australia we have our local MP. Whether we voted for them or not, we are their constituents, and so they have accountability and responsibility to that region as well as to their party. In Israel, Israeli MKs are really just answerable to their party and not to individual voters in that way. And I think that explains a lot about why Israeli politicians behave the way they do, because they're actually trying to prove their value to the party selection committee or to its leader. And it's worth noting that only a minority of parties even have a primaries process. So a lot of times a political party is just appointed by the leader. So you have a very different sense of responsibility and accountability there. It's worth noting as well that Israel does not elect the prime minister directly. They did try the system. It was scrapped back in the 90s, but it's the Knesset members that then recommend the prime minister. And then there's a process which actually involves the president by which the government is then formed through that. And as you noted, the government can only exist as long as it has the confidence of a majority, at least 61 out of 120 MKs. And then they have the opposite need to be able to block any dissolution votes that come in the 4 years. We are more or less, as you've noted, basically at the end of a 4-year process. This is actually not an early election in Israel's particular political history. Often they do not even last close to the 4 years.
And it's so true. And I think it's also stunning to so many Israelis, specifically after October 7th, and I'm sure also to many listeners around the world, stunning that this government has lasted this long. And it just goes to show how a strong coalition, right, when all the partners have a very deep interest in maintaining the life of the government, it can be maintained. Israeli governments fall quite often.
But in this case, it is actually the government's coalition partners that are moving this process forward, not the opposition.
Correct, but one of them, right? One of the coalition partners, which is the ultra-Orthodox. And some would say, or some analysis would say that, that this could also be something that they agreed upon in advance, right? They need to find the right date for the election. They need to find how to move forward without passing the very controversial draft bill. So it could be the right timing for all partners, right? You don't have to necessarily have to read into this, right? Especially with the ultra-Orthodox, where their politics are very much a politics of sectorial interest. So when we hear this kind of talk about them voting, for the motion of non-confidence in the government, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are, no longer confident in their alliance with Netanyahu. It might just mean that they want to get to the other side of the next election sooner than later.
And we should expect them to continue to be part of that coalition in future governments. It's not an indication that they're considering moving their loyalties to a different side of politics. So you mentioned the importance of a strong coalition. Talk to us about the way in which coalitions are formed and the significance of coalition building in Israeli government formation.
So again, we addressed how messy Israeli politics may look from the outside, but the mechanism is super duper simple. Israelis vote with one petek, one note. We have it here on the podcast cover, right? You vote with one note in the ballot box, and that note represents the party that you most associate with your values, okay? And it could even be a party that, you associate with very specific, legislation that they want to pass and very specific ideas that they have. And depending on the percentage that they receive from the overall voters, that's how many seats they receive in the Israeli Knesset. So up to now, that's simple. But for them to rule, for them to form a government, they need to create a group of at least 61. And this is where things get really interesting, because this is where the whole process of give and take between the parties starts to unfold. And so when you vote in Israel and you're voting for a party that represents you, at the end, you're also thinking what their end game is going to be and who they're going to form a coalition with. And that's what makes things so interesting. I might be all right with Netanyahu and his policies and his leadership and the Likud and the Likud values, but knowing that the Likud usually form coalitions with the ultra-Orthodox or with the ultra-right or with the settler movement could put me off the Likud and say, okay, I want to vote for a more moderate centrist party, which is the case for many Israelis today. The same goes for the other side, though. Okay, I might, be a moderate center voter, And I want, a moderate leader like Bennett or like Lapid, but I for absolutely not can accept the fact that they would form a coalition with, for instance, Arab parties, or even have the support of Arab parties in the Knesset for them to form a government. And that could be a reason for me to go to the other side. So really, it's all this game of who you're willing to sit with as much as what you believe in.
So voting in Israel, I think, could probably compare it in the same way that when you marry someone, you marry their in-laws, but in this case, you're marrying an entire family. And then you've mentioned that they will actually be judged on, usually on the extremes of that coalition and the extreme people in that coalition. So what I found interesting was Israeli Democracy Institute survey. It's called the Democracy Index. It came out in late 2025, and it asked whether Israelis felt represented by their parties. And according to that study, only about 26% of Israelis said there is a political party that closely represents their views. And then about 1/3 said that there's no party that represents them at all. And I think that's a very powerful reflection about why coalitions have become such a feature. Israel has never really been a two-party system. No party's ever won a majority of seats. But certainly those two main historical rivals, Likud and Labour, have devolved into, I think, possibly a 10-party system. And that's why the elections are quite difficult to predict. But it's also why the threshold becomes a very significant part of the process. So let me just explain what the threshold is. So in order to enter into the Knesset, a party needs to have 3.25% of the vote, and that would then give them 4 seats in the Knesset. There are a number of parties that hover around that number, and they may or may not get through. And if they don't get through, that basically reallocates the rest of the votes and can have a significant impact on the results. But if they do pass and they get those 4 seats, they can go from extinction to kingmaker overnight as well. So this election threshold also has a really big impact.
And this is kind of it's a paradox, because the majority of Israelis will vote for the bigger parties, right? And that's obvious, right? The parties that have 30 seats, 10 seats, 15 seats, right? They represent big chunks of the Israeli society. But this whole system that allows for smaller parties, right? Parties who only have 3.25% of Israelis supporting them and can have and therefore receive 4 seats, as you mentioned. That's a hugely significant, and it's got its pros and it's got its cons. Because if we look at the pros, right, the word is representation. Okay, it means that however small a group I am, however small an interest group I am, however small a sector I may be, right, I can form a party and I can have a chance to be in the Knesset, and that's exciting. I have a good chance to push legislation for issues that matter to me. And we saw some great examples over the years, right? We saw the Pensioners Party form in an election about a decade ago. They rolled in 7 seats, and with the promise of taking care of Israel's senior citizens and pensioners. We saw the party form, that I used to work for, Moshe Kahlon, the Israeli finance minister, who branched out of Likud to form a party solely for the issue of social justice and the housing crisis. And they brought in 10 seats, and they brought in, a lot of significant impact. Small parties, because they're needed to form a coalition, can really make or break the government. And they have that power. And sometimes they can use that power, for good, or for what we would consider good, like, moving on the housing crisis or taking care of senior citizens. But they can also use that power to promote or to coerce, otherwise moderate governments into much more extreme positions.
And I think that sometimes there's not so much focus on policy as there is on identity when it comes to these small groups. So there will be certain parties that certain voters gravitate towards, not necessarily because of policy, but because of identity. And why that matters is because the voter turnout also has an impact on the results of the election, including whether some of these parties pass the threshold. In Israel, voting is not compulsory as it is in Australia. And I think sort of an average about 70% is considered a good result these days. I think it was higher in the 70s, went low. But let's call it 70% as an average is considered quite good. But that's an average. So that doesn't then reflect certain sectors within the population. And I'm thinking of 2 which tend to very much vote in a identity way rather than a policy-driven way. So one community is the ultra-Orthodox community, and their voting rates are very high, higher than the average.
Extremely high, extremely high.
I believe it's can be up to about 90%.
Correct.
So that's
correct.
20 points above the average.
Mhm.
And on the other end, the Arab-Israeli sector tends to vote much lower than the average. And I think in their case, about 55%. I think maybe they got up to 60% in a particular election. So between differential voter turnout, between all of the different parties and interest groups, that the government isn't so much the voice of the people, the voice of the majority, as a bit of a roulette of numbers, who turned out, and often quite a lot of horse trading between the parties about what they will and what they won't accept in order to sit together.
Very true.
And I think it's very interesting that some sectors are very committed to voting and other sectors are uncommitted or disengaged. And that is not necessarily a function of how committed they are to Israel's democracy.
I think the rule here is the more extreme of an ideology you have, whether it's a political ideology or whether it's a religious ideology, the chances are you're going to go vote and commit to that ideology and make sure it makes it to the Knesset. While people who are more moderate and who can maybe tune out of Israeli politics and who maybe feel like they have the privilege to not care and to live their lives. Usually those kind of people don't have extreme views, right? And so the voting percentage in Israel is that dramatic because the less Israelis vote, the more power disproportionately makes it to the extremes.
And let's just connect the dots a little bit there. So the people who are highly engaged in elections are not necessarily the people who are highly committed to Israel's democracy. They may be more committed to using a certain majority in order to undermine some of Israel's democracy. And I think that's exactly what we saw happen with this current government, who was elected in late 2022 and proceeded pretty much straight after they were elected to table a series of legislative bills that would in practice significantly change the jurisdiction of the High Court. In fact, to limit the jurisdiction and the powers of the High Court. And that, of course, led to massive protests that we saw throughout 2023 up until October the 7th. But then, even through this war and through all of these other things that are happening, somehow the government continues on this process of trying to pass these bills. Some people call it judicial reform. Other people refer to it as a judicial overhaul. And the reason I bring that up is because that may have been the biggest election issue if all of these other election issues hadn't now joined the list, including the one that you raised at the beginning, which is the reason why the Haredi parties are looking to dissolve the Knesset around the draft law. So that itself, the issue of whether or not the Haredi population should be in compulsory army service alongside other parts of the Israeli population is a massive election issue. But they are very keen to limit the High Court powers as part of their ideology because the High Court is the whole reason that that issue is even on the table.
Correct. And look, I think there's something that needs to be said about the dynamic of Israeli politics over the past 20, 30 years, the majority of which Netanyahu has been the prime minister and the leader of the coalitions and of the governments, is that up until very recently, most of the Netanyahu governments and most of the Netanyahu coalitions were formed with a moderate centrist party and partner. We've seen coalition governments with Netanyahu that have been formed with the centrist party Yesh Atid. Today, represents the left-wing center in Israel in a very moderate voice. We've seen coalition governments of Netanyahu, even with Labor. We've seen that Netanyahu government coalitions with Tzipi Livni, and she was giving the mandate, to go and negotiate peace with the Palestinians. Netanyahu gave her that mandate as part of her joining his government. So Netanyahu always loves to have coalitions where there are more moderate parties and where there are parties to his left, okay? And then he can kind of create the more center stream. And to be frank, Israel saw 20 years of relative political stability and growth and economic growth and relative security, again, that exploded, due to this kind of leadership, due to coalitions forming around a broader consensus. What happened with this government and why it's so dramatic and why the Israeli center no longer will form any alliance with Netanyahu, and even the very right-wing factions of the Israeli center, who were previous partners of Netanyahu, and I'm speaking about Naftali Bennett, and I'm speaking about Avigdor Lieberman, who was perceived to the right of Netanyahu just a few years ago, right? Even they no longer want to form coalitions with Netanyahu, and main issue, as you mentioned here, is the issue of the Supreme Court. And this was triggered by Netanyahu's trial. The minute that Netanyahu was indicted by the state prosecutor, and the minute, the trial became a reality, many parties said, that's it, we're not going to join you anymore. The minute the trial turned into a reality was also the minute Netanyahu stood up. There's a very famous frame, standing on the stairs of his trial, all Likud ministers behind him kind of supporting him, and basically the prime minister of Israel saying, this is a witch hunt, and I'm against the Supreme Court. And then when he was reelected and managed to form a coalition with partners who are all with him on that agenda, that's when what we call the judicial reform or judicial overhaul, the really big push towards the judicial system and towards the legal framework and towards many other gatekeepers, by the way, as well, towards the media, towards the police. That's when that became, such a prominent part of their agenda. And that definitely alienated the Israeli center and, of course, the left.
There's a very obvious issue there of the rule of law. There's a moral issue there of a prime minister being a prime minister while he's standing trial. And I think in most countries, a prime minister would probably step aside during that time. So there is a moral issue. I know it's legal in Israel, actually, for the prime minister to continue. Ironically, if you're a minister and not the prime minister, you wouldn't be able to continue your duties. So there's an anomaly there that perhaps was overlooked. Maybe you could tell me, but it seems it was overlooked because who would ever think that someone morally would continue to serve as prime minister while under indictment?
It's not that it's legal. It's just that it's not illegal because it was never thought of by the Israeli lawmaker to have to draft that kind of law.
What these parties have understood is that there was a change to the rules of the game. And once there's a change to the rules of the game, the political process becomes a lot more complex. And I think that's really, these are sort of the undercurrents of everything that we see now, this sort of shift in the rules of the game and, more directly speaking, in the basis of Israel's democracy. And that's why the issue of democracy keeps coming up again and again and again.
There's something that is worth mentioning within this discussion, okay? Because notions of kind of limiting the power of the Supreme Court in Israel are not new. They've been held by many right-wing parties for years. And also, they've trickled their way to the center, okay? And even if we look at, if a leader like Naftali Bennett, who today is, a big name in the Israeli center, right? His party was known, and his justice minister, Ayelet Shaked, was known for having a very strong stance against the what they call disproportionate power of the Supreme Court.
And wanted to have influence on appointment of judges.
Correct. So these aren't new ideas in the Israeli right or in the Israeli center. And you could argue that they have merit, okay? And some do argue that they have merit. But when they were combined with Netanyahu's trial, and when it became so personal to him, right, that he's going to, push a huge piece of legislation, a huge reform against the very system that is currently holding him to trial, that's when people, even people on the right who believe in reform and who believe in changing the judicial system, that's when they said, enough. We can't have this.
When you say that this is possibly the most crucial election, it's because this is not just the outcome of a single election. It's really Israel's future and trajectory as a democracy that is at stake. And that's why I think Jewish communities in the diaspora, whether they realize it or not, are deeply invested in what happens next, whether that's emotionally, politically, culturally, or historically. There are many election issues that we'll unpack, but I think none are as salient for the diaspora as Israel's status as a liberal democracy. And in fact, under this government, Israel's status as a liberal democracy has already been downgraded. In 2024, VDEM, which is a leading international democracy watchdog, demoted Israel from being the top tier, which is a liberal democracy, down to what's classed as an electoral democracy, as a result of the work that this government is doing in order to limit the powers of the High Court and the judicial system.
And to be frank, it's not just a democracy index. It's also our national credit score. And when the big firms in the past years have demoted Israel's national credit score, they didn't even say it was because of the war or because of the terrible, catastrophic issues that have happened here, because they know that the Israeli economy is quite resilient to war. They said it was because of this whole democracy index and because of the judicial issues.
And I find that while diaspora Jews, especially now, and I've heard it during the recent hearings of the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion here, that people in the Jewish community raise this idea of maybe I need to live in Israel. And one of the things that I think is very important for them to understand is that that might be a choice about whether or not they want to live in a liberal democracy as well, if Israel does not change its trajectory from where it's at now.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Yeah, let's hope it. Yeah, let's hope it never comes to that, and let's hope we remain a liberal democracy.
Well, we'll actually have to return to be a liberal democracy at this stage. And these are the things that we're here to unpack in Politica. I know they're very emotionally charged topics, but I think if we can engage with them thoughtfully, this is an investment in our future, both in Israel and in the diaspora. And understanding the Knesset doesn't mean you have to agree with everything that goes on there, but it is certainly worth trying to understand not just the narratives and the catch lines and the political slogans, but to really have a nuanced understanding of what is also a complicated system, but that also has become a personal political struggle for the Prime Minister. And we've also managed to demonstrate that you can discuss Israeli politics at a reasonable volume. So please subscribe and follow us wherever you're listening to our podcasts. We'll be back to unpack what Israelis are arguing about, what they're not arguing about ahead of the election. This was Politica, Israeli politics explained at a diaspora volume. Until next time, keep the volume down.